we're going to consider the concept of Messiah in the pages of Mark's Gospel. It's important to understand first that the Hebrew word Messiah is exactly equivalent to the Greek word Christ. So when we read about Jesus being the Christ in the pages of the New Testament, there is the acknowledgement that Jesus is the Messiah, the long-awaited ruler, who is God's appointed means of establishing his kingdom on the earth. It's significant, therefore, that Mark begins his gospel with these words. Mark chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He's clearly wanting the reader to be aware that this extraordinary man that he's writing about, this Jesus of Nazareth, is no mere man, nor even a mere prophet. He's certainly no mere moral teacher. This is the Christ, the Messiah. Here he is. But what's extraordinary about Mark's Gospel is that Jesus seems very anxious in the early chapters for word not to get out straight away about his true identity. People are continually asking themselves the question and asking one another the question, who is this man? Who is this extraordinary messenger of God who is doing such incredible works among us? The demons know exactly who he is, but Jesus silences them. He does not permit them to speak out the truth about his identity as Messiah. And when Jesus heals the leper in Mark chapter 1, he gives the leper strict instructions not to tell people what's happened. A little bit later on, when he raises back to life the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, again, he gives the mourners gathered there strict instructions not to tell anyone what's happened. He doesn't want the news to break out too early about who he is. But then we get to a very significant portion of Mark's Gospel, and it's right in the very centre. Mark has structured his gospel very, very carefully. And right in the middle, at the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9, we read about two incidents that Mark puts back to back. At the end of Mark chapter 8, Jesus is in dialogue with his disciples, and he's asking them the question, who do people say that I am? And they have a number of answers to that question. They say, well, some people are saying that you are John the Baptist, back from the dead. Others are saying that you're Elijah, one of the greatest of the prophets from the Old Testament. Still others think you're another of the prophets. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And at that moment, Peter has a moment of inspiration and he says, you are the Christ. And Jesus once again tells the disciples not to tell anyone. But Peter's seen it. And of course, this is very significant because Peter in time becomes the leader of Christ's church. Now, immediately following that incident, Jesus continues his dialogue with the disciples and he tells them that the Son of Man, which is Jesus' way of talking about himself, needs to suffer and die. And Peter wants to take the Lord to task over these words. He rebukes him. No, Jesus, no, this can't happen. This must not be. And Jesus has stern exchange of words with Peter at that moment. And that dialogue then runs straight into another extraordinary incident at the start of Mark chapter 9. Jesus gets his three closest friends together, Peter, James and John. They go up on a mountainside. And there, an extraordinary event takes place where Jesus is transformed in the presence of his friends. He becomes transfigured. His clothes become dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And Peter, James and John see Jesus standing there with two of the greatest figures from the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. Now, Moses is the lawgiver. Moses is the means by which God's holy law was delivered to his people. And Elijah is one of the most significant of all the prophets from the Old Testament. There Jesus is, standing with these true figures of enormous importance in Jewish history, and yet the focus is on Jesus. And then those who are present hear this voice from heaven. God speaks, "This is my Son whom I love." Words, of course, which echo the words spoken over Jesus at his baptism in Mark chapter 1. "This is my Son whom I love. Listen to him." And what Mark has done is he's put back to back Jesus' conversation with his disciples, in which Peter blurts out, "You are the Christ," and then in Mark chapter 9, we have God's confirmation of the fact. The two stories go hand in hand. Well, Jesus' earthly ministry continues, and then we come to the time when Jesus goes into Jerusalem. This is the narrative that's often called the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus very deliberately chooses to ride into Jerusalem on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And he does so to fulfill a prophecy about the Messiah that we find in one of the Old Testament prophets, the prophet Zechariah. In Zechariah chapter 9, we read these words, "See, your king comes to you, gentle, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And then Zechariah talks about how this king is going to establish God's kingdom on the earth. Jesus is clearly presenting himself publicly as the Messiah, and he's welcomed into Jerusalem as such, because the people cry out, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." They recognize that here is the great king, like the great king of yesteryear, King David, who has come to establish an everlasting kingdom on the earth. Well, things don't quite work out perhaps in the way that the crowds would expect. Jesus takes on the rulers in Jerusalem, both the religious and the political authorities, and they nail him to a cross. But at his crucifixion, as Jesus breathes his last, Mark records that at that moment, the temple curtain was torn in two. The thick curtain that separated the people from the presence of God in the temple was ripped apart. It's Mark's way of saying now God's presence is no longer restricted to the temple in Jerusalem. Now God's presence is going to flood the earth, and all people everywhere will have equal access to the presence of God as a result of the suffering and death of this man. And what's even more significant, of course, is that the centurion who is responsible for overseeing the death of Jesus, a pagan, a non-Jew, at that moment recognizes, surely this man is the Son of God. So even at his death, a time of great shame and humiliation, a time when Jesus' enemies seem to have the upper hand, we've got this pronouncement from Mark that this is God's means of establishing his rule and reign on the earth. This is God's appointed means of establishing his kingdom on the earth, because this man, nailed to a cross, is the promised Messiah. And so back to Mark chapter 1, verse 1. We see that throughout the pages of Mark's Gospel, he's keen to show us at every point that this Jesus of Nazareth is no mere man. He is God's Messiah, the one who is going to establish God's kingdom on the earth.